As Michael strolled down the peaceful street in a neighborhood he rarely visited, the refreshing wind of a late summer evening caressed his face. Wearing a simple hoodie and trousers, he exuded a calm assurance, but his eyes moved quietly from side to side, carefully examining every home, vehicle, and mailbox. This lone man methodically analyzing an area that wasn't his home may seem strange to anyone who is paying attention. It's true that someone was observing. Officer Craig was sitting in his cruiser near a cul-de-sac, finishing a lukewarm cup of coffee, when he saw Michael. His imagination leapt to conclusions before logic could stop it, and his vision rapidly sharpened. "What's this guy up to?" he muttered, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. Michael stopped momentarily near a mailbox, jotting something into a small notepad. That sealed it for Craig. He flipped on his headlights and slowly crept toward Michael, who seemed unfazed by the sudden illumination. Craig parked the car and stepped out, his hand instinctively brushing against the holster on his hip. "Hey, you," Craig called out, his tone more commanding than questioning. Michael turned, his expression calm but unreadable. "What are you doing around here?" Michael smiled courteously, but his body did not move. "Good evening, officer. I'm just working." Craig narrowed his eyes and studied every aspect of Michael's appearance, including his attire, posture, and skin tone. "You mean work? Do you reside nearby?" Michael gave a headshake. "No, but I..." Craig interrupted him and moved in closer. "So why are you in this area? It will soon be midnight." Sensing the change in the officer's attitude, Michael inhaled deeply. "Officer, I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm just taking notes for a project." Craig squinted his eyes. "What kind of project?" Michael paused, obviously considering what to say. "I'd prefer not to. It's delicate work." To Craig, the answer was unsatisfactory, evasive, even. The officer's suspicion deepened, fueled by years of prejudice he never dared to confront within himself. The street lights cast long shadows as the tension thickened, an invisible line drawn between the two men. Craig's voice dropped to a low growl. "Look, you don't belong here. Either explain yourself, or we're going to have a problem." Michael held his ground, his tone calm but firm. "Officer, I'm not breaking any laws." Craig's jaw clenched. He didn't like being challenged, and in his mind, this man had already crossed the line. Craig's eyes flickered with frustration as he placed a hand on his belt, his thumb brushing the lip of his holster. The quiet street seemed to amplify every sound, the rustling leaves, the faint hum of distant traffic, and the tension building between the two men. "You need to stop being evasive and tell me exactly what you're doing here," Craig barked, stepping closer. His stance was intimidating, meant to provoke compliance. Michael took a half step back, keeping his hands visible and his voice steady. "I've explained what I can, officer. I'm doing my job. There's no law against being here." Craig scoffed, his irritation bubbling over. "Your job? What kind of job involves wandering around people's houses at night scribbling in a notebook? Sounds like you're casing the place to me." Michael's face remained calm, though a flicker of annoyance crossed his eyes. "I'm not casing anything, and I'd appreciate if you stopped making baseless accusations." The officer stiffened, his pride bruised by the man's composure. "Baseless, huh? Funny, because I don't see you offering any proof otherwise." Craig took another step forward, his tone growing sharper. "What's in the notebook? Hand it over." Michael hesitated, clutching the small notepad tighter. "It's private, officer. I'm under no obligation to show it to you." That was the tipping point. Craig's patience snapped, and he reached out to grab Michael's arm. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Michael instinctively pulled his arm away, his voice firm but not raised. "I'm not resisting you, but you're crossing a line." The officer's face darkened. "Crossing a line? You're the one out here creeping around, refusing to cooperate." Craig pulled out his radio, speaking into it with an edge of urgency. "I've got a suspicious individual refusing to identify himself. Requesting backup at Pine Grove Lane." Michael exhaled, his frustration evident now. "Officer, this is unnecessary. I don't want this to escalate." Craig smirked, his confidence bolstered by the knowledge that reinforcements were on their way. Should have thought about that before playing coy. Within minutes, another patrol car rolled onto the scene, its flashing lights casting red and blue shadows across the quiet neighborhood. A second officer, younger and visibly uneasy, stepped out. "What's going on here?" Craig pointed at Michael as though presenting evidence. "This guy's been wandering the neighborhood, won't explain what he's doing, and now he's refusing to hand over his notebook." The younger officer glanced at Michael, then back at Craig. Did he actually break any laws?" Craig's glare silenced the question. "His acting suspicious, and his resisting." Michael let out a slow breath, his calm demeanor unnerving Craig even further. "I'm not resisting anything. I'm standing here trying to avoid conflict, but I have rights, and you're violating them." The younger officer shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Craig, however, seemed emboldened by the standoff. "Enough of this. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Michael hesitated, his jaw tightening briefly before he complied. He turned slowly, placing his hands behind him as Craig snapped the cuffs on with more force than necessary. "Officer, this is a mistake," Michael said quietly as Craig guided him toward the cruiser. Craig sneered. "We'll see about that." As Michael was placed in the back seat, he glanced back at the scene. The younger officer lingered by the patrol car, his expression troubled, as though questioning whether this was right. But the flashing lights and the quiet tension swallowed any objections he might have voiced. The drive to the station was silent, save for the crackling of the police radio. Craig's satisfaction was palpable, a man convinced he had just stopped a potential threat. Michael, however, stared out the window, his expression unreadable but his mind clearly at work. The fluorescent lights of the station flickered slightly, casting a cold, sterile glow on the reception area. Officer Craig marched in, gripping Michael by the arm with unnecessary force, as if to assert dominance. The desk sergeant, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, looked up from her paperwork, her expression shifting to mild curiosity. "What's this about?" she asked, eyeing the calm yet restrained man at Craig's side. "Caught him prowling around Pine Grove Lane," Craig declared. "Refused to explain himself or hand over what he was carrying. Suspicious behavior all around." Michael stood silently, his gaze steady but unreadable. The sergeant raised an eyebrow. "Did he resist arrest?" "Not physically," Craig muttered, almost begrudgingly, "but he was obstructing." Michael finally spoke, his tone measured. "I was standing on a public sidewalk doing nothing illegal. This officer decided that wasn't good enough for him." The sergeant sighed, clearly used to diffusing heated exchanges. "All right, let's process him and figure this out." Craig led Michael toward the holding area, grumbling under his breath. As they passed by a small office, Michael turned his head slightly, catching a glimpse of a nameplate on the desk, Special Agent Williams. His lips curved into a faint smile, unnoticed by Craig. After the paperwork was completed, Michael was placed in a holding cell. The room was dim and sparsely furnished, but he didn't seem fazed. Instead, he sat on the bench, his posture relaxed, as though he had all the time in the world. Craig returned to the main desk, smirking triumphantly. "Another one off the streets," he muttered. The sergeant looked at him sharply. "Don't pat yourself on the back too quickly. Let's see if there's even a charge that'll stick." Michael, overhearing the exchange, leaned back against the wall. His calm demeanor was beginning to unnerve Craig. It was as though he knew something the officer didn't. Minutes turned into nearly an hour before Michael finally spoke up, his voice carrying across the holding area. "I need to speak with someone in charge." Craig snorted from his desk. "You'll speak when I say you can." The desk sergeant frowned. "Craig, protocol says he's entitled to request a supervisor." Craig rolled his eyes but picked up the phone anyway, dialing the number for the shift supervisor. "Yeah, I've got a guy in custody demanding to speak to someone higher up," he said, annoyance dripping from his voice. "Fine. I'll bring him over." When Craig opened the cell, Michael stood without resistance, walking calmly beside him toward the supervisor's office. Craig couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this man wasn't afraid of him, or the system. Inside the office, a tall man in a crisp suit stood waiting. His badge was clipped neatly to his belt, and his presence commanded respect. Craig faltered slightly as the man extended a hand toward Michael. "Agent Holloway," the man said, his voice calm but authoritative. Michael reached out, shaking the man's hand firmly. "Thanks for coming, Agent Williams. Sorry for the interruption." Craig's face drained of color. His mouth opened, but no sound came out as the realization hit him. "Wait, Agent." Michael turned to Craig, his eyes locking onto the officers. "That's right. FBI. I've been working an undercover operation in this area for weeks." The air in the room grew thick with tension as Agent Williams' gaze shifted to Craig. "Is this true? Did you arrest an undercover agent without probable cause?" Craig stammered, searching for words. I didn't know. He wouldn't say who he was." "Did you ask?" Michael interjected calmly. The supervisor's expression darkened. "Craig, we'll discuss this further. For now, I suggest you step outside." Craig left the office with his face flushed, a mix of confusion and embarrassment clouding his thoughts. He slumped into a chair at the front desk, his mind racing. In all his years on the force, he'd never felt the ground beneath him shift so suddenly. The man he'd cuffed and hauled into the station with self-righteous confidence was an FBI agent, a detail he hadn't even bothered to check. Meanwhile, inside the supervisor's office, Agent Williams gestured for Michael to sit. The air between the two men was calm but purposeful. "Let's get this straight," Williams began, his voice even. "How much of the operation did this incident compromise?" Michael leaned back slightly, his demeanor still composed. "It's hard to say. I was monitoring activities in the area tied to a larger network we've been tracking for months. Tonight was critical. Key individuals were supposed to meet nearby. But now, thanks to this." He paused, gesturing vaguely toward the situation outside. "I'm not sure they'll show." Williams frowned, rubbing his temple. "This is a serious problem. We can't afford delays at this stage." Michael nodded. "I understand. But this also highlights another problem, one we've ignored for too long. Officers like him," Michael said, his voice sharper now, "are not just a public relations nightmare. They actively hinder our ability to do our jobs." Outside the office, Craig sat rigidly as the sergeant approached him, her expression unreadable. "You've really done it this time," she said, her tone low. Craig looked up, defensive. How was I supposed to know who he was? He wasn't cooperating. The sergeant folded her arms. "You didn't bother to ask. That's the issue. You jumped to conclusions, and now it's biting you in the ass." The door to the office opened, and Agent Williams stepped out, his face stern. He addressed the room without hesitation. "Sergeant, I need a full incident report, including this officer's account." Craig stiffened, his hands clenching into fists. "Look, I didn't do anything wrong. The guy was acting suspicious. I was just doing my job." Michael emerged from the office behind Williams, his eyes fixed on Craig. "Your job," he said quietly, his words cutting through the room like a blade, "is to protect and serve, not to harass and assume. You didn't ask questions. You didn't follow protocol. You just saw me and made up your mind." Craig opened his mouth to respond, but the weight of Michael's words left him momentarily speechless. Williams turned to Craig, his tone colder now. "Do you realize how close you came to blowing a federal operation? How much damage you could have caused?" Craig stammered. I didn't know he was FBI. He didn't identify himself." Michael stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "I didn't identify myself because I was in the middle of an undercover operation, something I could have explained if you'd given me the chance." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Williams turned back to the sergeant. "Initiate a formal complaint against this officer. This department needs to take a hard look at its practices." Craig's face turned ashen. "A complaint? Are you serious?" Williams' eyes narrowed. "Dead serious. Your behavior wasn't just reckless, it was dangerous. This isn't just about me. It's about the countless others you've treated the same way who didn't have the benefit of a badge to protect them. Craig slumped in his chair, his bravado completely deflated. Michael's voice softened slightly, but his words still carried weight. This isn't about ruining your career, officer. It's about accountability. Because if no one holds you accountable, what's to stop you from doing this to someone else, someone who might not have the same outcome I did? The sergeant nodded quietly, already making notes. The rest of the station was silent, officers exchanging glances but saying nothing. The days following the incident were anything but quiet. The Internal Affairs Department launched an immediate investigation into Craig's actions. His entire record was pulled, every arrest, every report, every complaint filed against him over the years. The findings painted an unsettling picture. Craig had a long history of targeting individuals based on little more than a hunch, and many of those individuals happened to look like Michael. Though most of the complaints had been dismissed due to lack of evidence, the pattern was impossible to ignore now that it was laid bare. At the station, the atmosphere was tense. Officers whispered in hallways, their conversations dropping to hushed tones when Craig entered the room. Some defended him, calling it a misunderstanding. Others avoided him entirely, knowing the weight of what was coming. Michael, meanwhile, continued his work with the FBI. But the incident had left a sour taste in his mouth. He knew this wasn't an isolated case. It was a symptom of a much larger problem. A week later, the department held a press conference. The chief of police, flanked by members of Internal Affairs, addressed a small crowd of reporters. "We take these allegations very seriously," the chief began, his voice measured but firm. "Our officers are held to the highest standards, and any behavior that undermines the trust between law enforcement and the community will not be tolerated." Craig watched the broadcast from his home, his jaw tight. He'd been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation, but he already knew his career was over. The community's reaction was swift and divided. Some residents of Pine Grove Lane expressed outrage, calling for Craig's immediate termination. Others insisted he was being unfairly targeted, claiming he was just doing his job. But it was Michael's quiet testimony during the Internal Affairs inquiry that left the deepest impact. Sitting across from a panel of investigators, he recounted the night in detail, his tone even and unemotional. "When I walk into a neighborhood, I'm not just a man. I'm every stereotype, every prejudice, every assumption that someone like Officer Craig has ever been taught," Michael said, his voice steady. "And that's not just his failing. It's a failing of the system that allowed him to believe those assumptions were acceptable." The inquiry lasted several weeks, during which Michael's story gained traction in the media. Headlines like "FBI Agent Exposes Racial Profiling in Local Police Department" dominated the news cycle. The incident became a lightning rod for discussions about police reform, sparking protests, town hall meetings, and even a push for mandatory bias training within the department. Craig, meanwhile, faced mounting pressure. When the investigation concluded, he was formally dismissed from the force. Internal Affairs cited a pattern of conduct unbecoming of an officer as the reason for his termination. Michael heard the news while preparing for another operation. His reaction was measured. "One down," he muttered under his breath, "but there's still so much more to do." Back at the station, changes began to take shape. Officers were required to attend bias training sessions, and a community oversight board was established to review complaints of misconduct. These were small steps, but they were steps nonetheless. In the months that followed, the ripples of that night on Pine Grove Lane continued to spread. The community, once content to ignore the quiet injustices around them, began to speak out. Town meetings grew crowded with voices demanding accountability. People who had long felt invisible finally had a platform to share their experiences. Michael, ever the professional, moved on to his next assignment. But the memory of that night stayed with him. It wasn't the first time he'd been profiled, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. Yet it had sparked something, a conversation that was impossible to ignore. Craig, meanwhile, found himself grappling with the consequences of his actions. Without the badge, he was just another man in the crowd, forced to confront the biases he had wielded for so long. For the first time, he began to listen, to the news, to the voices in his community, and to the small but growing part of himself that whispered he had been wrong. The incident became a case study in training programs across the country. Law enforcement agencies dissected what went wrong that night, using it as an example of how prejudice can blind even the most seasoned officer to the truth. For the audience watching this story unfold, there's a stark lesson to take away: assumptions have power. They shape how we see the world, how we treat others, and ultimately how we live our lives. But those assumptions can be challenged. It starts with a question: what if I'm wrong? To the officers who protect and serve, Michael's story is a reminder that authority comes with responsibility, not just to enforce the law, but to uphold the dignity of every person they encounter. And for the rest of us, it's a call to action, to demand better, not just from our systems, but from ourselves. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect on your own assumptions and the role you play in creating a more just world. Share this video, leave a comment, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories that inspire change. Because sometimes, it's in the moments of greatest conflict that we find the greatest clarity.